Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, July 2nd, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of earlier programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. The first piece is entitled The San Francisco Murals and the Suicide of the Left by Diana Johnstone. The decision of the San Francisco School Board to obliterate the historic murals in George Washington High School is not just another instance of identity politics foolishness. It's also a terrifying illustration of the drastic mental decline of what is called the left. Back in the 1930s, there was an American left that had brains. You could agree or disagree with it, you could love it or hate it, but it had ideas, purpose, talent, and a sense of common humanity. It was working for a just society that would end exploitation and benefit humanity as a whole. As an example, there were the artistic projects of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the principal New Deal program to combat the Depression, which extended from creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority to artistic enhancement of public buildings. That's what the WPA did. That's what the New Deal did. A beneficiary of this enhancement was George Washington High School in San Francisco, which was blessed with a striking set of murals by a leading artist, Victor Arnautoff, a Russian immigrant who'd worked with the Mexican master of socially conscious mural art, Diego Rivera. One would expect the presence of these powerful murals would be a lasting cause of pride in their school and staff, for the school, the staff, and the students. The WPA, not least in its arts projects, was animated by leftists and even downright communists like Arnautoff, who chose to depart from the sterilized "I cannot tell a lie" cherry tree myth and the crossing of the Delaware glorification of George Washington to introduce reminders of the forgotten victims of the foundation of the United States, the exploitation of African slaves, and the violent expropriation of Native American lands. The murals were clearly part of the left-wing WPA intellectuals' endeavor to raise social consciousness, a step towards the civil rights movement of the 1950s. In the age of the House Un-American Activities Committee and Joe McCarthy's drunken rampage, such red-tinged WPA projects exposing the less glorious side of the birth of the Republic aroused hostile suspicion. And yet the Arnautoff murals survived Nixon, HUAC, and the McCarthy witch hunts. It took identity politics to call for their destruction. What is most shocking is that the African-American president of the San Francisco Board of Education, Stephen Cook, supports this destruction of the murals on grounds that they include, quote, violent images that are offensive to certain communities, close quote. Jolie Proudfoot, director of the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center in San Marcos, said it was not worth saving the art if one Native student, quote, is triggered by that. Everything is wrong with such a position. Education should include teaching people to analyze what they see rather than simply be triggered. The contemporary world is crammed with images that are deeply offensive. When a student can have an historic mural torn down because she or he is triggered by it, what sort of preparation is this for the future? School should not be a safe place for emotions, but a preparation for using reason to master those emotions as one goes through life. The protesters have chosen the worst possible way of interpreting the murals instead of using their reason to understand them and place them in their context. Yes, slavery happened, and yes, American Indians were slaughtered, and their descendants can think of the strength they needed to resist and survive, and draw from their tragic history a sense of compassion for all who suffer from comparable injustice today. The attack on the mural is a gesture of impotent spite. What are the hurt feelings of a San Francisco high school student compared to the pain and hunger of a Yemeni child living under U.S.-supported bombing? George Washington is dead, but in the city named after him, American leaders are sponsoring the massacre of innocent civilians around the world. Why don't these super-sensitive American students use their sensitivity to oppose such ongoing crimes and develop their intelligence to figure out how to join with others in fighting to end the permanent war state in Washington? But the snowflake trend has no use for real strength, the strength of courage to overcome obstacles, and draws an artificial moral strength from perpetual emotional weakness. Instead of gaining strength from increased knowledge, a certain tendency of young persons who have not suffered, as their forebears did, cling to their victimhood as the key to their own privileges. This may bring a few momentary advantages, but it's disastrous in the long run. A healthy society is based on a balance between respect for the individual, regardless of identity or origins, and awareness of belonging to humanity as a whole, with all its sufferings, joys, tragedies, and aspirations. Closing oneself into a limited identity group denies both respect for individuals and awareness of universal humanity. It can only be a basis for endless conflict. Quote, "My people are better than your people," close quote. Quote, "No, my people are better than your people," close quote. Those who win a momentary victory by imposing on others a destructive act of iconoclasm are only confirming their identification as losers as their sole key to success. With such divisions, the American people will be absorbed in tribal skirmishes, while their criminal rulers continue to spread devastation around the world. That's Diana Johnstone's account of an incident occurring now on the West Coast, but raises general questions of the use of history or the abuse of history for contemporary American politics. As we move into this Independence Day week, the historian Gerald Horne was asked, what should we understand about the founding of the United States? He answered, we should understand that July 4th, 1776, in many ways, represents a counter-revolution. That is to say that what helped to prompt July 4th, 1776 was the perception amongst European settlers on the North American mainland that London was moving rapidly towards abolition of slavery. This perception was prompted by Somerset's case. Look that up if you want. A case decided in London in June 1772, which seemed to suggest that abolition of slavery, which not only was going to be ratified in London itself, was going to cross the Atlantic and basically sweep through the mainland, thereby jeopardizing numerous fortunes, not only based upon slavery, but the slave trade. That's the short answer. The longer answer would involve going back to another revolution, that is to say the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, which among other things involved a step back from the monarch, for the monarch, the king, and a step forward for the rising merchant class. This led to a deregulation of the African slave trade. That is to say, the Royal African Company heretofore had been in control of the slave trade, but with the rising power of the merchant class, the slave trade was deregulated, leading to what I call free trade in Africans. That is to say, merchants then descended upon the African continent, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight with the energy of demented and crazed bees, dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean and to the North American mainland. This was prompted by the fact that the profits for the slave trade were tremendous, sometimes up to 1,600 or 1,700%. And as you know, there are those even today who will sell their firstborn for such a profit. This, on the one hand, helped to boost the productive forces both in the Caribbean and on the mainland, North America, the coming United States, but it led to numerous slave revolts, not least in the Caribbean, but also on the mainland, which helped to give the mainlanders second thoughts about London's tentative steps towards abolition. What's being suggested here is that the American Revolution was a revolution in defense of what had made the colonists, or at least some of them, wealthy, that is, slavery. It's well known that up until the middle of the 18th century, London felt that the Caribbean colonies, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua in particular, were in some ways more valuable than the mainland colonies, the colonies in what would become the United States. The problem was that in the Caribbean colonies, the Africans outnumbered the European settlers, sometimes at a rate of 20 to 1, which facilitated slave revolts. There were major slave revolts in Antigua, for example, in 1709 and 1736. The Maroons, that is to say, the Africans who had escaped London's jurisdiction in Jamaica, had challenged the crown quite sternly. This led to many European settlers in the Caribbean making the great trek to the mainland, the future U.S., being chased out of the Caribbean by enraged Africans. For example, Gerald Horne says, I did research for my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, in Newport, Rhode Island. And the main library there, to this very day, is named after Abraham Redwood, who fled Antigua after the 1736 slave revolt because many of his, quote, Africans, close quote, unquote, were involved in a slave revolt. And he fled in fear and established the main library in Newport to this very day and helped to basically establish that city on the Atlantic coast. So there's a close connection between what was transpiring in the Caribbean and what was taking place on the mainland. And historians need to recognize that even though these colonies were not necessarily a unitary project, there were close and intimate connections between and amongst them. Probably a majority of American historians think of slavery in the United States as primarily a system of race relations, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. One historian has gone so far as to call slavery the ultimate segregator. He does not ask why Europeans seeking the ultimate method of segregating Africans would go to the trouble and expense of transporting them across the ocean for that purpose, when they could have achieved the same end so much more simply by leaving the Africans in Africa. No one dreams of analyzing the struggle of the English against the Irish as a problem of race relations, even though the rationale that the English developed for suppressing the barbarous Irish later served nearly word for word as a rationale for suppressing Africans and indigenous American Indians. Nor does anyone dream of analyzing serfdom in Russia as primarily a problem of race relations, even though the Russian nobility invented fictions of their innate natural superiority over the serfs as preposterous as any devised by American racists. It's well known that more Africans fought alongside of the Redcoats, the British government troops, than fought with the settlers, the American colonists, in the so-called American Revolution of 1775. This is understandable Because if you think about it for more than a nanosecond, it makes little sense for slaves to fight alongside slave masters, so that slave masters could then deepen the persecution of the enslaved, and indeed, as happened after 1776, bring more Africans to the mainland, bring more Africans to Cuba, bring more Africans to Brazil for their profit. Listen to President Obama's remarks at a White House 4th of July celebration a few years ago. This is how Obama described what happened in the so-called American War of Independence from 1775 to 1813. 1775 to 1803. President Obama said, "On July 4, 1776, a small band of patriots," let me go back and correct something I just said. The American Revolution, so-called, the American War of Independence, which Horn points out was a counter-revolution to the fear that Britain was moving to the abolition of slavery. That lasted from 1775, when the first battle was fought on Lexington Green in Massachusetts, to 1783, when a peace treaty between the newly independent American colonies and Great Britain was signed. Obama explains these events as follows. On July 4, 1776, a small band of patriots declared that we were a people created equal, free to think and worship and live as we please. That our destiny would not be determined for us, it would be determined by us. And it was bold, and it was brave, and it was unprecedented. It was unthinkable. At that time in human history, it was kings and princes and emperors who made decisions. But those patriots knew there was a better way of doing things, that freedom was possible, and that to achieve their freedom, they'd be willing to lay down their lives, their fortunes, and their honor. And so they fought a revolution, and few would have bet on their side. But for the first time of many times to come, America proved the doubters wrong. And now, 237 years later, this improbable experiment in democracy, the United States of America, stands as the greatest nation on earth, close quote. That's not our current president speaking, that's the last one, President Obama. And the nonsense in that, the notion that what was behind the American Revolution was anything other than a defense of slavery, it does not stand any sort of close investigation. Gerald Horne's book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, is the most recent and most thorough attack on this mythology. Horne says, with all due respect to President Obama, I think that he represents in those remarks you just cited the consensus view. That is to say that on the one hand, there is little doubt that 1776 represented a step forward with regard to the triumph over monarchy. The problem with 1776 was that it went on to establish what I refer to as the first apartheid state. That is to say, the rights that Mr. Obama refers to were accorded to only those who were defined as white. To that degree, I argue in the book that 1776, in many ways, was analogous to the unilateral Declaration of Independence in the country then known as Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in November 1965. UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, was in many ways an attempt to forestall decolonization. 1776 was an attempt to forestall the abolition of slavery. That attempt succeeded until the experiment crashed and burned in 1861 with the U.S. Civil War, the bloodiest conflict to this point the United States has ever been involved in. So Horne is asked, how does this story, this what you call counter-revolution, fit in with your latest book, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow? Horne answers, there's a certain consistency between the two books. Keep in mind that in 1762, Britain temporarily seized Cuba from Spain. And one of the regulations that Britain imposed outraged the settlers, as I argue in both books. What happened was that Britain sought to regulate the slave trade, and the settlers on the North American mainland wanted deregulation of the slave trade, thereby bringing in more Africans. What happens is that was one of the points of contention that led to a detonation and a revolt against British rule in 1776. I need to say a word more here about the economic conflict between Britain and the U.S. One of the reasons Britain was moving to the abolition of slavery, an abolition that would affect its colonies, was that the British were being outproduced by the slave economy of the United States, not the future United States. Horne says, I go on in the Cuba book to talk about how one of the many reasons why you have so many black people in Cuba was because of the manic energy of U.S. slave traders and slave dealers, particularly going into the Congo River Basin and dragging Africans across the Atlantic. Likewise, I had argued in a previous book on the African slave trade to Brazil that one of the many reasons why you have so many black people in Brazil, more than any place outside Nigeria, is once again because of the manic energy of U.S. slave traders and slave dealers who go into Angola in particular and drag Africans across the Atlantic to Brazil. It seems to me that it's very difficult to reconcile the creation myth of this great leap forward for humanity in the American Revolution when after 1776 and the foundation of the United States of America, the United States ousts Britain from control of the African slave trade. Britain then becomes the cop on the beat, trying to detain and deter U.S. slave traders and slave dealers, once again, not perhaps from noble motives, but from the competition that America presented to the British economy. It seems to me that if this was a step forward for humanity, it was certainly not a step forward for Africans, who the last time I looked comprise a significant percentage of humanity. Horne has asked, slavery was not just an issue of interest in the South, the Southern plantation owners, but that in the North, banking, insurance, merchant, shipping were all involved in the slave trade as well. Horne answers, New York City was a citadel of the African slave trade, even after the formal abolition of the U.S. role in the African slave trade in 1808. Rhode Island was also a center for the African slave trade, ditto for Massachusetts. Part of the unity between North and South was that it was in the North that the financing for the African slave trade took place, and it was in the South where you had the Africans deposited. It helps to undermine, to a degree, the very easy notion that the North was abolitionist and the South was pro-slavery. What most surprised me, writes Gerald Horne, was the restiveness, the rebelliousness of the Africans involved. It's well known that the Africans in the Caribbean were very much involved in various extermination plots, liquidation plots, seeking to abolish through force of arms and violence the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, I think that historians on the North American mainland have tended to downplay the restiveness of Africans, and I think it's done a disservice to the descendants of the population of mainland enslaved Africans. That is to say that because the restiveness of Africans in the United States has been downplayed, it leads many African Americans today to either A, think that their ancestors were chumps, that is to say that they fought alongside slave owners to bring more freedom to slave owners and more persecution themselves, or B, that they were ciphers, that is to say they stood on the sidelines as their fate was being determined. Horne has denied both these points on the basis of the historical evidence. He's asked here, so as we move into Independence Day weekend, next weekend, what do you say to the people of the United States? What I say to the people of the United States is that you have proved that you can be very critical of what you deem to be revolutionary processes. You have a number of scholars and intellectuals who make a good living by critiquing the Cuban Revolution of 1959, by critiquing the Russian Revolution of 1917, by critiquing the French Revolution of the 18th century, But yet we get the impression that what happened in 1776 was all upside, which is rather far-fetched given what I've just laid out before you in terms of how the enslaved African population had their plight worsened by 1776, not to mention the subsequent liquidation of independent Native American polities as a result of 1776. I think that we need a more balanced presentation of the foundation of the United States of America, and I think there's no sooner place to begin that than next week with July 4th. That's Gerald Horne, the historian, author of the Counter-Revolution of 1776, with an account that flies in the face of the jingoistic mythologies about the American Revolution that we were all taught and that children continue to be taught in the United States. We should tell the truth and shame the devil. We'll conclude tonight with a video from Richard D. Wolff, economic update on the rise and fall of the USSR. Along with a more accurate account of the history of the United States, we need a less propagandistic account of the U.S. 1%'s peer competitors, as Zbigniew Brzezinski called them, Russia and China. And a contribution to that is Professor Wolff's account that will run in the next few minutes. Aware and on the Air is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman with Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. We rely on our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog, Digital Citizen, we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes to this program. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly, by the way, by our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.